I'm Margaret Brennan, and this week on Face the Nation, celebrations in Israel as 4 hostages are rescued in a daring mission. Plus, our new poll has some surprising findings on the presidential race here at home. Tearful reunions after 4 hostages held by Hamas for 8 months were finally returned to their families.
Thank you for bringing my son to me, to us.
But the bold operation, aided by U.S. intelligence, came at a high cost of more than 200 Palestinian lives. And the prospect of a ceasefire in Gaza to allow the return of the more than 115 remaining hostages is still very unclear. Here at home, the pressure builds on President Biden to do more to end the bloody conflict that's also taking a political toll on his re-election. National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan will join us, as will the World Food Programme's Cindy McCain, with an update on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Plus, a new CBS poll on what voters think of some of the more controversial policy plans of both candidates.
I will stop the invasion and we will begin the largest domestic deportation operation in the history of our country.
Trump ally Senator Lindsey and President Biden confidant Senator Coons will both be here. Finally, the message from D-Day and how it holds true today.
Democracy is never guaranteed. Every generation must preserve it, defend it, and fight for it.
It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. President Biden will be returning from his visit to France today, and it'll be a quick turnaround as he'll return to Italy for a Group of 7 meeting with America's top allies later this week. At the top of the agenda for both trips, the 2 ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine, as well as how to handle aggression from the countries not represented at that meeting, Russia and China. We spoke with President Biden's National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan earlier today and began by asking him about the Israeli hostage rescue and whether military operations are the way to free the remaining that are still held captive.
By far, the most effective, certain, and right way to get all of the hostages out is to get a comprehensive ceasefire and hostage deal that President Biden described in public a few days ago, that Israel has accepted, and now that we are awaiting Hamas to respond to.
Jake, I know the U.S. provided intelligence support to this military operation. Are you at all concerned that it will imperil the chances at that diplomatic agreement? And is there an expiration date by which Yahya Sinwar has to respond to this offer?
It's a fair question, Margaret. What will Hamas do in terms of its calculus on this deal following this operation? And I, of course, cannot put myself in the head of a Hamas terrorist. But the fact is that the whole world is looking to Hamas to say yes, because for all those people, for all these months who've been calling for a ceasefire, now's the moment. There could be a ceasefire tomorrow, today even, if Hamas would say yes to the deal. So from our perspective, the world needs to continue to reinforce that message quite clearly and strongly. We have not gotten an official response yet from Hamas. We're waiting for one. We're waiting to hear from the Qataris and the Egyptians, who are the mediators in communication with them. And we will continue to reinforce the message, take the deal, until we get that answer.
Jake, I was looking back at remarks you made on this program just a week after that horrific attack on Israel on October 7th. And even in the early days, you were pressing the Israeli government for a clear plan on what they will do in Gaza the day after the war ends. Has Netanyahu accepted any of the U.S. proposals or suggestions? Has he presented any of it to his own war cabinet?
We do have a detailed discussion with our Israeli counterparts about the day after. But we also have been clear, as you said, from the very beginning, that a military strategy to defeat a terrorist group has got to be connected to a political and humanitarian strategy and a logical strategic endgame. And too often over the course of this conflict, we have not seen that clear connection, and we have continued to reinforce the need for Israel to bear down to ensure that it has a holistic strategy to ensure the enduring defeat of Hamas and to ensure a better day of peace and stability for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
So it sounds like no agreement on that as yet. President Biden gave an interview to Time magazine that was published this past week, and he was asked whether he's seen evidence of Israeli war crimes in Gaza. He said the answer is it's uncertain and has been investigated by the Israelis themselves. He dismissed the idea Israel was starving people as part of its war strategy, but he also said, I think they've engaged in activity that is inappropriate. What would you say is inappropriate?
Well, actually, Margaret, a couple of weeks ago, the State Department put out a comprehensive report that didn't just speak in generalities. It went into specific incidents that raised real concerns.
And it was inconclusive, which is what the Secretary of State said on this program at that time.
Right, and it's exactly what the president said as well when he was asked the question. We do not have enough information to reach definitive conclusions about particular incidents or to make legal determinations, but we do have enough information to have concern. More than concern, our hearts break about the loss of innocent Palestinian life. The president himself has said publicly that innocent Palestinians are going through sheer hell in this conflict. And a lot of that is because Hamas has put them in an impossible situation. Hamas hides among the civilian population, holds hostages among the civilian population, fires at the IDF from behind the civilian population. And so, yes, we have asked Israel to take steps to be more precise and targeted in its military operations. But there is only one answer to all of this, and it's the answer I keep coming back to, which is a ceasefire and hostage deal that would end the suffering, end the conflict, end the war, and bring all of the hostages home.
The president recently approved allowing Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons to fire across the Russian border, a restricted area, but still a new policy choice here. Has that made a difference on the battlefield?
From the president's perspective, this was common sense. What was happening up around Kharkiv, which was new just in the last couple of months, was a Russian offensive where they were moving from one side of the border directly to the other side of the border. And it simply didn't make sense not to allow the Ukrainians to fire across that border to hit Russian guns and emplacements that were firing at the Ukrainians. So the president authorized that. The Ukrainians have carried out that authorization on the battlefield. And one thing I will point out is that the momentum of that operation in Kharkiv has stalled out. Now, Kharkiv is still under threat, but the Russians have not been able to make material progress on the ground in recent days in that area. And the United States will continue to support Ukraine in holding the line and pushing back against the aggressing Russian forces.
Well, as you know, Vladimir Putin said in response to that Russia has the option to arm Western adversaries in response. One of your top aides here in Washington on Friday gave a pretty notable speech, Jake, in which he said the U.S. may need to soon increase its stockpile of strategic nuclear weapons, given the expanding arsenals of America's adversaries. Have you seen evidence that Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are sharing nuclear technology at this point? And what would trigger President Biden to make that decision?
Well, Margaret, I can't speak to intelligence matters, especially highly sensitive intelligence matters relative to nuclear capability. But what I can say is that we are concerned. We are concerned about cooperation among the countries you just mentioned, and we're concerned about the advancing nuclear arsenals of countries like China and Russia, as well as North Korea. This is something that we are focused on, we are looking hard at, and we will consult with our allies and partners on the best way forward to ensure a safe, reliable, and credible nuclear deterrent by the United States. We've taken no decisions. We will monitor the situation closely.
Is this because China has brushed off your attempts at arms control?
Well, actually, Margaret, in the last few months, China has showed a greater willingness, not a lower willingness, to engage with us on questions related to proliferation and arms control. Those are nascent conversations. They're nothing like the kinds of intense arms control negotiations that we had with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War or Russia in the post-Cold War era. But it's the beginning of a dialogue.
Jake Sullivan, thank you very much for joining us from Paris.
Thanks for having me.
We turn now to our latest CBS News poll of the 2024 presidential race. and it shows the likely nominees effectively tied. Among voters across all 50 states, former President Trump leads President Biden by 1 point, 50 to 49. But if we're looking at voters across the 7 states identified by CBS as the battlegrounds likely to decide the election, those numbers are flipped, and President Biden is ahead of his predecessor by 1 point, 50 to 49. Joining us now for some analysis is our Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, you've been telling us this is going to be a close race. Data supports that at this point. We're now 10 days past that Trump conviction in a New York courtroom. What have we learned?
That conviction matters some. The impact is limited, but it's there. And here's why. First of all, context. Voters do not rate the trial as anywhere near as important as things like the economy and inflation, things where Donald Trump has advantages. But we do see a little bit of activation there, especially among the Democratic base, of voters for Joe Biden who are now more motivated by opposition to Donald Trump. Specifically, the number of Joe Biden voters who say that their primary reason for voting for Joe Biden is to oppose Donald Trump is up, and it's now a majority of his vote. We've also seen folks among the Democratic base a little bit more motivated to turn out, kind of erasing some of that expressed turnout advantage that the Republicans had in the battleground states, and among a couple of key demographic groups, independents, et cetera, where Biden gets a little bit of traction there. But again, one of the reasons that this is limited is that then the Trump folks tell you they think the charges aren't serious. They think everything is political. What it does do, though, is put a spotlight on the campaign to define what this campaign is about. And when you ask people, is this a judgment on Donald Trump for you? When that happens, Joe Biden wins those voters by 2 to 1. But when people say that this contest is about a comparison between the two or a referendum on Joe Biden, Donald Trump does much better. And part of the reason he does much better is that Trump does better than Biden on a lot of these qualities, like being tough, being effective. Biden does better on being personally liked, on being compassionate. What does all that tell you? Is that each of these campaigns is going to try, at least in part, to make this campaign about the other guy as much as, or at least or more, as what they're going to do.
Anthony, let's talk about some of the issues you say are important to voters. The border's one of them. President Biden did issue an executive order this past week. It authorizes U.S. officials to deport large numbers of migrants without processing asylum claims until the border crossings number dips below 1,500. So it's essentially suspending some of the asylum processing. Trump's been perceived as stronger on the border. Does this change anything?
No, Trump still is. More people think that Donald Trump's policies would stop or slow border crossings more than Biden's. Having said that, there is widespread support when we test in general terms for what President Biden just did. He gets 7 in 10 support on that. It's overwhelming among Republicans. It's also strong among Democrats. Look, context there. People have said they think that the border is in crisis for a long time. Having said that, you know, we have a lot of the campaign rhetoric speaking of what people say they would do. You've seen the Trump campaign talking about mass deportations. We tested that in a general way in principle. Would you support a new government program that would deport all people living in the U.S. illegally? And that finds majority favor. That finds 6 in 10. It's strongest among folks who are MAGA. It's strongest among Trump supporters, but also from some Democrats as well. And I think that that speaks to the general idea, not just that people see the border as a crisis, but also where we are in the campaign, where a lot of very dramatic or new proposals out there are finding favor here.
So unpack that a bit, because this 62% of Americans favor deporting all undocumented immigrants. So Homeland Security says that President Biden has already deported or repatriated more people in the past year than any year since 2010. And then, depending on the details of what's talked about on the campaign trail, some of what Mr. Trump talks about could be illegal. It doesn't seem practical in some sense to round up children. And then we know that the courts have questioned whether local authorities would have the ability to do it. and federal authorities don't have the resources. So what exactly do people think they're supporting?
Well, when you measure public sentiment on this or really just about any policy, you're getting a sense of direction, you're getting broad brushstrokes, but those kinds of details, well, that's often up to the legislatures and the courts later on. We tested even the idea of should local law enforcement be involved in this, and a lot of folks do say yes. Again, the details of that, the specifics, you're not going to pick that up in an aggregate public opinion.
They weren't tracking the Supreme Court decisions.
Undoubtedly not. But look, it does tell you, though, for the viewer watching this campaign, that what we're seeing here connects to whether it's the courts, what some people say is the politicization of the courts, these ideas of mass deportations, et cetera. We are in a different era in which a lot of folks say the system as a whole is not working. And all of these, if you connect the dots through them, are part of that reaction against it, which explains some of that general sentiment for some of these policies.
It's really just kind of a do something.
Do something.
Anthony Salvanto, thank you very much for your analysis. Face the Nation will be back in 1 minute, so stay with us. We turn now to Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. He joins us from London. Good morning to you, Senator.
Thank you.
I know you were at those D-Day remembrances earlier in the week, and you met with President Zelensky as well. He has asked for more training for his forces and for that to happen faster and inside of Ukraine. Do you support the U.S. doing that?
Yes, I do support us training inside the country. You know, the delay in weapons because of House inaction, we did lose momentum. But from the very beginning, the Biden administration, they did not impose pre-invasion sanctions to deter Putin. They didn't give weapons to Ukraine early on to deter Putin. And now we've got a chance to reset this war that they have the weapons. Here's what he wanted most of all: for us to go after the Russian assets all over the world, take the money from the sovereign wealth funds of Russia and give it to Ukraine. There's $300 billion sitting in Europe from Russian sovereign wealth assets that we should seize and give to Ukraine. We have Russian money in America we should seize. We should make Russia a state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law. When I suggested that to President Zelensky, he lit up like a Christmas tree. Making Russia a state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law would be a very big blow to Russia.
Right. I don't know that the Biden administration would sign off on that, though. But in terms of what you just mentioned,
they won't.
with the assets, President Biden did say this morning he had reached an agreement with President Macron of France on the use of profits from those frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. I know the Europeans haven't wanted to go ahead and seize assets because it would hurt their banks.
Yeah. Well, they want to use the interest to help you. Either we're going to help Ukraine or we're not. It's now time to give them the F-16s, let them fly the planes, long-range artillery to hit targets inside of Russia, go after Putin's assets wherever they're at, all over the world, go on the offensive. I think this summer, Ukraine will regain military momentum. Everything we've done with Ukraine has been slow, it's been indecisive. But if we went after the assets that Putin has all over the world, take his money that's stolen from the Russian people and help the victims in Ukraine, I think it would do a lot to end this war.
Your Republican colleague, Senator Tommy Tuberville, just this past week said on Steve Bannon's show that Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator and unconstitutional. And he said this about Vladimir Putin.
He doesn't want Ukraine. He doesn't want Europe. Hell, he's got enough land of his own. He just wants to make sure that he does not have United States weapons in Ukraine pointing at Moscow.
Those echo some Russian talking points, Senator. I wonder if those remarks from your fellow senator represent the GOP.
No, it represents him and him alone. If you spend 15 minutes studying Putin and what he wants to recreate the Russian Empire. He's not going to stop in Ukraine. We celebrated the 80th anniversary of D-Day. It was a failure. It was the unnecessary war described by Winston Churchill. We had a dozen chances to stop Hitler. It's not about NATO, it's not about American weapons in Ukraine. It's about a megalomaniac wanting to create the Russian Empire by force of arms. If you don't stop him, there goes Taiwan. So we've been slow as hell of helping Ukraine, but Senator Tuberville's analysis really misses what Putin's all about. He's an outlier, I think, in the Republican Party. I like him personally. But what did Trump do to get the weapons flowing? He created a loan system. They're sitting on $10 to $12 trillion of critical minerals in Ukraine. They could be the richest country in all of Europe. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin $10 or $12 trillion of critical minerals that he will share with China is ridiculous.
I want to get to the Middle East with you as well. Later today, Benny Gantz, one of the ministers in Prime Minister Netanyahu's war cabinet, is expected to announce his resignation, which he has previously said would happen if he wasn't handed a day after plan. The defense minister has also said there is no planning for the day after happening. Where is this headed?
I think Mr. Gantz will withdraw from the war cabinet, but Bibi will still have a majority. I like Benny Gantz. Here's what I found on my last trip to Israel just a few days ago. There's universal opposition to creating a Palestinian state by all levels of Israeli society if it is seen as a reward for terrorism of October the 7th. The day after plan, when Hamas is destroyed militarily and they no longer can threaten Israel, needs to be a negotiation between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE to come up with a plan for Gaza and the West Bank to give the Palestinians hope and a better life and secure Israel. That is the only plan I see working. You cannot occupy, Israel can't, in my view, permanently Gaza. That will be a disaster for Israel.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't said that clearly yet, that he would not seek to occupy.
He's coming July the 24th. I've spent a lot of time with Bibi. He is right to want to make sure there will be no stop to this war until Hamas is destroyed militarily and cannot threaten another October 7th. I've had very detailed discussions with the Prime Minister and with the Crown Prince and this administration. I believe there will be forming in the next week.
I want to talk to you more about this.
There will be a plan coming about.
All right, we have to talk more about this on the other side of the commercial break, though, so just give me a minute or two, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We return to our conversation now with South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. Senator, thank you for staying through the break for us. Before we went to it, you said by July 24th, when the Prime Minister of Israel is here in Washington to address the joint session of Congress, you do expect a plan for the day after. Do you expect, given the limited amount of time left, that there will be normalization with Saudi Arabia and Congress will be able to vote before the election?
I think it's still possible, but the administration's taken months to negotiate the defense agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States, holding it over Israel's head regarding Rafah. I think we're almost there. One thing I got from this trip was that they still don't have the weapons they need in Israel to finish off Hamas. So they're going to be sending me a list of weapons that are being slow walked. So I'm going to bring that up. But yeah, I think we can still do this. July the 24th will be here before you know it. Hopefully major military operations will be over against Hamas if we give Israel the weapons they need. And we can sit down and talk about a vision for Gaza and the West Bank that will give security to Israel, hope and prosperity for the Palestinian people, with Saudi Arabia and the UAE involved. So that is my hope, that is my belief, and I want to help where I can.
We'll see if that vote can be taken. Sir, you just mentioned U.S. military aid. Our poll out today shows a majority of Americans 61% say the U.S. should not send Israel weapons. 6 in 10 says Israel should stop or decrease its military actions in Gaza. Isn't it time for this war to end now, given that the tide of public opinion is turning against Israel?
I think it'd be the biggest mistake we could. I criticize Senator Tuberville for his view of Ukraine. Let me be straight with you. Hamas would kill everybody here if they could get here. Israel's not our enemy. They're our ally. Well, they can't because they're pinned down over there. I want them destroyed so they can never come back to hurt Israel or us. Hezbollah is alive and well. So to those Americans who believe pulling the plug on Israel now makes us safer, you've missed a lot. Radical Islam wants to slit the throat of every Jewish person and your throat too. So no, I want to give weapons they need. The administration's withholding weapons. Trump was a great ally of Israel. If he wins this election, he'll have another great ally. I appreciate what President Biden's doing, but it's all been so slow. So if you don't, Iran, here's the big takeaway from my trip. The IDF chief told me he's never been more worried about a nuclear breakout regarding the Iranians than he is right now. He thinks we've lost deterrence. He's asking for joint military operations with the United States to convince Iran not to dash toward a nuclear weapon. These are the most dangerous times since the 30s. Don't make the mistakes of the 30s. Senator Tuberville said, give Putin what he wants. Yeah. Well, that's what we did in the 30s. That didn't work out. Pull the plug onto Israel. That didn't work in World War II. It's not going to work now.
Very quickly, before I let you go, in this past year, the Biden administration deported, expelled, or repatriated more than 740,000 people, which they say is more than any year since 2010. You this week said there need to be mass deportations. Aren't those numbers mass deportations?
They've had 10 million people come into this country illegally. It's the highest level of illegal immigration in the last 3 years in the history of the country. We went from the lowest under Trump to the highest in recorded history. They're never going to stop coming until they see people leaving. On day one, President Trump will deport people here legally by the tens of thousands. Then and only then will this stop, and Biden will never do that.
Well, you also know that Congress would have to provide the resources to do that to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and they say they don't have the manpower or the money to do any of that.
Well,
at that scale.
If Trump is president, his top priority will seal that border, deport here people illegally. We're living on borrowed time when it comes to another 9/11. If you're looking for somebody to fix a broken border and keep us safe, Donald Trump, I believe, is your best choice. And if you don't believe that after the last 3 years, you're making a big mistake.
Senator Graham, joining us from London today. Thank you for your time, sir. We turn now to Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons. He is the national co-chairman of President Biden's re-election campaign, and he joins us this morning from his home state. Senator, let's pick up on the border since we just left that there. This new order the president just implemented this past week authorizes immigration officials to deport large numbers of migrants without processing their asylum claims. You were critical when Donald Trump used this 212F authority under his administration. Why do you support President Biden's use of it?
Because there's a stark difference in the values that President Biden and former President Trump bring to trying to address the issue of border security and immigration. I'll remind you, Margaret, that former President Trump tried to implement a Muslim ban, a ban on entry to this country explicitly based on one religion. He also used cruelty, the forceful separation of parents from their children and the caging of children at our border to try and deter folks from coming to seek asylum or to seek refuge in our country. President Biden has time and time again asked Congress to enact a broad solution to our border security and immigration challenges. And after months of negotiation between Senators Lankford, Sinema, and Murphy, we were one day away from putting on the floor of the Senate that bipartisan solution. Former President Trump intervened to stop it because former President Trump actually wants a problem to solve through his election rather than a solution that a bipartisan group of senators stood behind. President Biden is moving ahead with forceful leadership at securing our border. President Trump is simply making a political issue of this.
And we should say you are co-chair of the Biden campaign. Senator. But we did cover that border debate and the bill in depth on this program. But on the premise itself of the authority being used, there is a lot of approval in our polling of what the president just did. But it looks, frankly, like they're just trying to get caught trying, since the administration admits the courts likely will halt this. The ACLU says they're going to sue over it. Asylum is a human right under international law. What do you think this is signaling to Biden supporters, particularly in the progressive left of your party?
I think it's signaling that President Biden is determined to address issues that are a very broad concern to the vast majority of Americans. He would prefer that it be done by legislation. As you just pointed out, legislation that could provide the resources, the judges, the processing, the immigration funding that would make for a more balanced, humane, and sustainable solution to our border crisis. I'll remind you, former President Trump tried to use gimmicks like building a border wall and is now threatening to nationalize to federalize the National Guard and use it to deport tens of millions of people already here in the United States. The difference between Trump's approach and Biden's approach is one of cruelty versus effectiveness.
So only in our polling, only about 20% believe President Biden's policies would decrease the number of migrants. Are you worried that it's just simply too late? I mean, we've been talking about process in Congress. We've been talking about this executive order for months now, and the trigger was just pulled this week. Is it too late?
No, I don't think it is, because frankly, I think the American people understand the difference between substance and showmanship. President Biden, every year in his State of the Union, has asked for bipartisan initiatives to address the border and to address immigration. And there's one party, the Republican Party, that time and time again has rejected bipartisan solutions to immigration and the border. And frankly, what I also hear as I've campaigned across our country for our president is grave concern about the commitment to reproductive rights, to fundamental freedoms by the current MAGA Republican majority and by former President Trump. He is bragging that he nominated to the Supreme Court 3 justices who reversed Roe versus Wade and who have now put contraception at risk. That's why we took a vote in the Senate last week, Margaret, to make it clear that Democrats will protect fundamental rights, where Republicans, under the leadership of former President Trump, are putting them at real risk.
I want to ask you about the Middle East. You described Prime Minister Netanyahu's last address to a joint session of Congress in 2015 as a political rally against then President Obama. We're in this election year. There has been tension between our two leaders. Do you expect the Prime Minister to have an election rally against President Biden?
Boy, I sure hope not. But Prime Minister Netanyahu has a long record of being very partisan and very divisive. For decades, Margaret, the strong bipartisan support for Israel, for its security, has been a hallmark of our close alliance. But I'll remind you, Prime Minister Netanyahu isn't just divisive here, he's divisive at home. For months and months before the October 7th attacks, the largest protests in Israeli history were occurring week after week in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem against steps that Prime Minister Netanyahu was taking, putting at risk the rule of law. And Benny Gantz, a centrist, decorated IDF war hero, will likely today announce that he is leaving Netanyahu's war cabinet because there's no clear plan for the path forward. Our President Joe Biden has been leading a strong effort to try and secure a hostage release and a ceasefire. It's been embraced by all of our close allies in the G7, and it's my hope that that can still be accomplished. But frankly, if Netanyahu isn't coming to speak to Congress about his plan for securing peace, his plan for the path forward, I don't know why we would go.
So why would the Democratic leader in the Senate agree to something that could potentially be so damaging to the president?
Well, Senator Schumer has publicly said that it was with some reluctance, some concern about how Prime Minister Netanyahu has this past practice of using an address to Congress to be divisive. He has a chance to help rebuild and secure bipartisan support for Israel. He has a chance to present a positive path forward towards peace. Look, I respect how hard Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham, has worked to try and bring together Saudi normalization with Israel in exchange for Palestinian self-governance. That's an important effort many of us have been involved in. Prime Minister Netanyahu has a chance to show that he will be a real leader, not just a partisan leader, but someone who will try and secure peace and stability for Israel. It's my hope that that's what will happen, and that's why Senator Schumer agreed to invite him to speak to a joint session of Congress.
Senator Coons, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. We're joined now by the Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program, Cindy McCain. Good to have you here in person.
Thank you.
Now, overnight, we learned that U.S. pier off of Gaza that was set up by the military has reopened. It had stopped functioning for a bit. How is it going? Because I know you are helping to oversee distribution.
Well, right now we're paused because I'm concerned about the safety of our people after the incidents yesterday. We also, two of our warehouses, the warehouse complex were rocketed yesterday. So we've stepped back just for the moment to make sure that we're on safe terms and on safe ground before we'll restart. But the rest of the country is operational. We're doing everything we can in the north and the south.
How did your locations get rocketed? I imagine you do deconflict and share your locations with the Israeli military.
We are deconflicted. I don't know. It's a good question.
Did you lose any of your
We had one man injured, but everything else is fine. There's nobody else hurt. But indeed, it's the kind of thing. That's why a ceasefire is necessary. That's why we need to stop this so that we can get in at scale with our aid and other aid from other organizations as well. We can't continue this in a way because what almost happened in the north with famine could happen in the south. And so that's what we're trying to avoid right now, and it's been very difficult just because of what's going on. You know, we've had looting inside the country. Mm-hmm. We've had various problems around with it. You know, there's always something going on. It's very difficult to operate there.
You mentioned just now the full-blown famine in the north. When you said that, it got a lot of attention. Prime Minister Netanyahu was asked about your comments by NBC and said, quote, Cindy McCain, unfortunately, is misinformed. The Israeli government's been putting out pictures of food being brought into Gaza. They dispute there is famine. How does that square with what you are seeing on the ground?
When I made that comment, my people had seen it on the ground, not only evidence of it, but the actual impact of it. Since then, they've allowed us to get more trucks into the north, and so we're getting much more food in up there, and that will stave it off. But listen, the bottom line here is I make choices every day to take food from the hungry to give to the starving. We need a ceasefire. We need it now so that we can feed, and this doesn't happen in the south. We're right on the edge in the south of the same thing occurring.
You're on the edge of famine in the south of Gaza?
Yes, there's people that are very hungry and don't have access because of the danger, or because they've been pushed, into the center again. So we want to make sure that we can not just get in and feed, but do it at scale. They need more than food too. It's water, it's sanitation, it's medicine. So it's all of the above, because famine is not just about starving, it's about all the other things too.
And I know how difficult I've heard it is to help a child with stunted growth.
Yeah.
You just said you're taking from the hungry to feed the starving. You are dealing with a lot in Sudan as well.
Yes.
The United States said paramilitary forces murdered 100 people this past week, including children. And I know the Biden administration says the world's not paying enough attention to Sudan. What's happening, and are they already at famine?
Well, Sudan has the real possibility of becoming the world's largest humanitarian crisis. We cannot get food in. We can barely get food in. We certainly aren't getting it in at scale. And you see the results of what can happen if people aren't fed. We're also coming into the lean season, which makes it very difficult many times for our trucks to even operate if they can get in. We need more, same drill, we need more crossings, we need safe and unfettered access. And that's the same for Gaza, by the way, safe and unfettered access. And making sure that we can get in and make sure we can feed at scale. Once again, it's about the agreements from various people and various factions and all of this. Bottom line is people are going to starve to death unless we can get in there.
We've been talking all week long about America's role in the world. And the U.S. is still the largest donor to the World Food Program. When you were here last June and we spoke, you said you were trying to encourage China to get involved with funding, but also get their expertise with technology and agriculture. Are they stepping up at all? Are other countries stepping up?
Other countries are stepping up. It's not to the scale that it was 2 years ago, but countries have stepped up. And in the case of Sudan, a few more have stepped up to it. Sudan is a forgotten crisis, and its implications being a destabilizing factor in that region can have catastrophic effects as it comes down the line. So it's really imperative that we get the crossings open, that we have safe access, that the various factions understand that we're humanitarian and we need to have the access.
And to your point, U.S. intelligence has said that if this isn't acted upon, that it can contribute to the growth of terrorism.
Absolutely.
Just like in
Gaza. People will do anything to feed their families, and if it comes down to it, terrorism may be the choice they have to make.
Cindy McCain, thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thanks
your
for
good
covering
work.
it. Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. President Biden this morning ended his trip to France by laying a wreath at a cemetery just outside of Paris, where American soldiers and Marines were buried in World War I. Shortly after, he explained why the trip was necessary.
The idea that I'd come to Normandy and not make this short trip here to pay tribute. And it's the same story. Think about it. America showed up. America showed up to stop the Germans. And America shows up when we need it, just like our allies show for us.
Earlier this week, the president marked 80 years since the D-Day invasion that helped begin the liberation of Europe from Nazi control and touted American leadership and democracy on the world stage. It inspired us to look at some of the lessons of our past. 20 years after the victory at Normandy, Walter Cronkite returned there with Dwight Eisenhower.
You see that high ground right above there?
The former president reflected on his decision as Supreme Allied Commander to storm the beaches and liberate Europe from Nazi Germany.
I devoutly hope that we will never again have to see such scenes as these. But these people gave us a chance, and they bought time for us so that we can do better than we have before.
This week, President Biden, a small child in 1944, praised the few surviving veterans whose bravery, he said, we need to summon again.
We're living in a time when democracy is more at risk across the world than any point since the end of World War II, since these beaches were stormed in 1944.
The tyrant bent on domination now, he said, is Vladimir Putin, whose soldiers have taken Ukrainians from their homes away to filtration camps, abducted Ukrainian children, and sent invading forces to ravage Ukraine. Putin's axis of allies includes rising power China, North Korea, and Iran.
The autocrats of the world are watching closely to see what happens in Ukraine, to see if we let this illegal aggression go unchecked.
Biden wasn't the only one hearing echoes of the past.
Oh, you're the savior of the people. Here's my eyes.
99-year-old D-Day vet Melvin Hurwitz called President Zelensky a hero. Former President Donald Trump has a very different opinion of Zelensky, and Trump argues the largest invasion in history is underway now at the U.S. southern border. This past week, he said our worst enemy is within America.
I say we have the enemy in from within, and we have the enemy from the outside. And I'm telling you, we are in more danger from the enemy from within with these lunatics, these fascists, these communists, and we're going to stop that also.
Past presidents have also gone to Normandy and called on weary Americans to remember that deterring conflict today costs less than fighting it tomorrow.
We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent.
The ascendant far-right forces in Europe, riding the wave of a backlash against migration there and a surge in anti-Semitism, reflect another strain on the international system. Similar divides here at home raise questions about whether we've forgotten that ignoring hate or appeasing authoritarians can come with an unimaginably high cost. One paid 80 years ago by these troops, who, as Eisenhower said, bought time for us so that we can do better than we have before. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.